there are people following us with ESSEC YouTube channel, they are welcome. And we look at the questions they are likely to ask on ESSEC YouTube channel. So for the people following us with ESSEC YouTube channel, we will follow your questions and we'll try to make some connections with what is happening here. So still 1 minute and then we start.
François, sorry.
Oui, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes,
I'm not sure everybody can see the link with the Framapad because on the chat you can only write to one person. So I'll send it to you and I send it to Julien as well. But I have no other option like to write for everybody on the chat.
I don't know if Irvan or someone from ESSEC can do something for us about that, about this issue.
Could you repeat, Claire, what you said? Because I was watching YouTube in the meantime.
Okay. No, actually, it's just okay. Before you can't send to everybody the link for the Framapad, but now it's okay, I think, on the chat.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
So we will start right on time. As you saw, we have a very dense, tight schedule, so it's very important to start on time. I'm very happy to welcome today Tim Berker from Glasgow University. Tim's research involves the critical analysis of digital technology in contemporary audiovisual culture, working in the tradition of media archaeology and spanning the fields of media theory, art theory, and the philosophy of technology. Tim conducts research that involves considerations of aesthetics in relation to the technological infrastructure of image making. In particular, he has explored the ways that both old and new media technologies have facilitated the potential to generate new experiences and philosophical concepts of time. His first book, Time and the Digital, traces connections between the philosophy of time in the work of Gilles Deleuze and Whitehead, and uses this to explore questions of time, history, and memory in relation to digital aesthetics, communication technology, and contemporary interactive art. His second book, and correct me if I'm wrong, which will be the focus of today's keynote. So this book entitled Against Transmission, Media Philosophy and the Engineering of Time pairs archives research into the history of media technology with philosophical inquiry in order to explore the ways that experiences of time have been engineered through the history of measurement and storage media. So Tim, we are very, very happy to welcome you today. Your topics are strongly related to OAP topics. So we look forward to learning from you and hearing you. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Francois, and thanks to all the organizing committee for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here virtually. I hope the internet holds up for me. If I freeze, someone just yell at me or put something in the chat to me. What I'm going to try and do in this paper is talk about some of the ideas from the second book, but also some from the first book. Some things I've been kind of on my mind for the last 10 years or so, really. And I hope that it's going to put into place some ideas that might resonate with some of the other papers in this workshop. Certainly from looking through some of the titles in the program, some of the brilliant papers, it seems like it will. So so let's start. Let's start somewhere quite general, and somewhere that spans the historical and the contemporary. And I want to start in particular with the question of technology and time. And let's start with looking at the philosopher Michel Serres, the philosopher you might be familiar with for some people, less so for others maybe. So first of all, we can read in Serres an argument that technology's function is to put us humans in contact with time, with a particular type of time. So his argument, this comes in his later works, in the kind of humanism works, I guess. So this argument is related to human evolution, and his position that the way humans have evolved is based on the temporalities that they've invented, what he calls the temporal niche that we occupy. So this is based mostly on Serres' reading of the anthropologist André Leroi-Gourhan, and the idea that once our hands became free, so once we stopped walking around on all fours, they could use tools and then invent things that importantly externalized human functions. And that therefore technology entered into time in the sense of being embedded in the evolution of our functions. So it was linked to the way we evolved. This is Serres' argument and Leroi-Gourhan's argument, that it was linked to the way we evolved and to the temporality of our bodies. I should probably start sharing my screen as well. Sorry. Okay, can everyone see that? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. So like I said, we're starting with the general, and somewhere that of course is discussed by other media theorists and philosophers of technology too. I'm thinking in particular of McLuhan and of course Stiegler. Serres is thinking about all technology here, not just about the digital, but from his reading of Leroi-Gourhan, he can present a new take on our relationship to digital technology, especially in his development throughout his later humanism period of his concept of hominescence. In general, he talks about the computer in terms of formatting and ordering information, but in classic Serres style, he does this by going back to things like timekeeping in monasteries and Renaissance bookkeeping in Venice, and religious myths, particularly St. Denis, who walked around with his head in his hands, like people with mobile phones in their hands, with knowledge externalized. So Serres' work on digital technology interests me because Serres is a non-digital thinker, not just because he was in his 80s when he started to write about smartphones and his granddaughter's generation, but because he is a thinker of synthesis rather than analysis. And that's something that I feel very close to. So he's not interested in fragmentation, but he's more interested in trying to provide the conditions for things to come together. But like Alex Galloway says, digital thinking is usually predicated on precisely the opposite thing, on separation, on dialectics, on moving the one into the two, on binaries. And Serres is interested in precisely the opposite, in connecting things, in seeing what happens when things combine, in seeing how much older ways of doing things are related to the contemporary. So how can we use this approach to think about the digital and the kind of fragmentation that it's premised on? So in this talk, I'm going to look at some of the historical underpinnings of the digital as a medium of fragmentation, and then see how some artists, like Serres does with philosophy, are making images that explore the limits of media. So some people will, of course, be reminded of Bergson, some of Stiegler's and grammatization, but my starting point and my starting point for interpreting Serres is actually Whitehead, and the drive to think of experience as both discrete and continuous at the same time. So for Whitehead, time is constituted by the becoming and perishing of actual entities as the smallest, final real things of existence. But of course, they're not really things, they're processes. These actual entities, like drops of experience, are not experienced one by one, but rather they come at us all at once. They have jagged boundaries. So this comes from Process and Reality and the Concept of Nature. His two books. And because of this idea of togetherness, his theory of time is one that offers us a version of temporal thickness that is similar to Sayre. For Whitehead, each moment, each actual entity contains or prehends the entities that came before it and provide the conditions for the entities that come after it. So according to Whitehead, in experience, these societies of actual entities come at us all at once as a complex mixture. So that's why I think it's important to look at media history when we think about the contemporary. Okay, so for Whitehead, each moment is thick with the past and the future. Importantly, he gives us a time where the past continues in the present as part of the constitution of an actual entity, as something real that exists in what he calls the extensive continuum. So some people might be reminded of Deleuze's well-known discussion of immanence here. So specifically in Adventure of Ideas, Whitehead, another one of his books, Whitehead argues that it's not enough to confine the past to memory or the future to imagination, but to think of time as the objective existence of the past and the future in the present. To think about this novel production of togetherness, as he puts it. This togetherness provides the conditions for the becoming of subjects in the present. Each moment is a transition between these two worlds. So anecdotally, and probably taking, I admit, a bit too much poetic license in my reading of Whitehead here, you might say that some of these ideas have a foundation in Whitehead's own story. So Whitehead's son Eric died fighting in World War I, which had a profound effect on Whitehead, on his pacifism and his philosophy in general. And maybe this idea of the past persisting in the present is somewhat of a result, a togetherness in time with the past that produces the subject in the world. So that the togetherness with this kind of ongoing trauma of losing a son. So if we think about media this way, we think about a past, a media history that continues in what we think of as contemporary formats. And we also begin to think about what contemporary media say about our relationship to the idea of a future. So more will be said on this later. So not only does Whitehead offer us a picture of time as thick with drops of experience, he also, like Sayre, gives us a way to think about the becoming of the subject in connection with technology. And this is my particular reading of Whitehead and I guess my particular contribution to Whitehead scholarship, thinking about Whitehead and technology. So the reason Whitehead gives us a way to think about technology in a novel way is because every actual entity enters into what he calls a becoming in connection with contemporary occasions. So a subject doesn't use an object, but instead the subject and object are mutually constituted in an ongoing sense, depending on the things that happen in the encounter. So this is quite similar, I think, to Sayre and his idea of exo-Darwinism, this idea of the evolution with technology. And of course, this isn't necessarily a conscious thing that's happening for Whitehead or for Sayre. It's the connection between the two that produces ways of thinking. So if we're using these ideas to think of media, it might be a way to think of our relationship with media technology beyond this notion of a user or a receiver that comes to the encounter consciously. Right? More on this later too. So we have a time described by Whitehead where moments have jagged boundaries, where different scales of temporality exists. But if we look at time as it is lived today and the way it's mediated and controlled, we feel a bit of a tension. Time, at least for me, feels much different to Whitehead's idea of the procession of actual entities, as eventful, as pushing towards a future. There's a tension between the way Whitehead asks us to think about time and the media ecologies that currently measure time and organize temporality. So here in this talk, I'm going to focus on those things, those obstacles and interruptions to Whitehead's flow of time, pushing towards a future. And importantly, Whitehead also tells us that the subject, what we might call the digital subject, becomes based on a process of connecting to other things. And so we might ask how this process is structured by media that function based on breaking things into parts rather than on synthesis. So the time that Whitehead once told us about has changed. But to try and explore the new conditions for temporality, we still need to stick to Whitehead's approach, thinking about measurement and experience in the same breath. So to do this, I'd like to begin with some moments from the history of technologies of audiovisual media, the history of film, of TV, and computers, which is what I do in the book Against Transmission. But here in this talk, I'm going to focus on only a few historical details because otherwise I'll just run out of time. And these details might provide a way to begin thinking about a philosophy of what we could call analytical media that is mainly about measurement. So I'm going to try and think about how a particular digital subject is produced by analytical media, and then start to try and think beyond this position using an approach inspired by Sayre and Whitehead and process thought in general. Okay. So Anna Tushling writes, switching, regardless of how this is realized technologically, is a crucial activity of all computers and presumes the measurability of time. That is, a clock, as well as a recurring syntagmatization of time, namely through timing, or more precisely, the discretization of time. So this is the big idea that I want to introduce, and that we'll see running through the rest of the talk. Technical apparatuses, in this case media apparatuses, create a particular type of time in which we live through what Tushling calls syntagmatization, a term that's from linguistics and it's about the relation between signs and meaning. So we could think of this as the ordering of structures through a technical process of making things discrete. And this is precisely a type of time, this discrete type of time produced by technical apparatuses. It's precisely a type of time that these technical apparatuses are able to measure. They allow us to develop a knowledge and an experience of time that they can, that is only technically possible to measure. Is this a type of reduction of subjects to what can be measured and ordered? So we might say that the clock enables us to introduce a discreteness into time, so that time for some purposes can be regarded as a succession of instants instead of a continuous flow. A digital machine must essentially deal with discrete objects, as Alan Turing devised it. As Turing says, digital machines work in jumps or clicks. Although somewhat familiar now, this seems at odds with what we experienced in the 20th century. The 20th century was an era of mass media and synthesis, writing, television, radio, and cinema. And these were based on synthesizing together parts into a whole, words into sentences, frames into movement, and in the case of TV, viewers into a public. Now, sometime later in the century, this changed. The computer was invented, and soon all media became able to be digitized, from writing to cinema. Media became input to be processed by the computer, rather than itself the outputs of a process of synthesis. So a type of fragmentation took place. And we can read about this in terms of the fragmentation of audiences from television scholars to the discorrelation of images from post-cinema scholars like Shane Denson and Steve Shaviro, where images produced by the computer no longer correlate to the familiar 20th century mediated human perception and produce a different relationship to reality, a shift from the cinematic spectator to something else. So our ideas of subjectivity and of images and of what's possible to be represented change as all media becomes digital. Friedrich Kittler famously said that when this happened, media theory became media history, spelling a kind of end of media in place of digitalization. Now, of course, this was nothing completely new. Media seemed to have its end built into its beginning, as the media archaeologist Wolfgang Ernst has shown, from before its beginnings, mass media was premised on mass media was premised not on communication or reproduction, but on measurement. So for film theorists, the images of Murray and Muybridge of chronophotographs measuring animal movement come to mind. So these were images meant to be seen as stills. They're a way of stopping movement so that it can be studied. Another 20th century medium, the television, was developed in high-tech laboratories like Bell or invented by people like John Logie Baird, more interested in the measurement and transmission of light and solving engineering problems than they were in thinking about representation or aesthetics. To borrow one of Ernst's own examples, Edouard Leon Scott's phonoautograph shows the way mass media have roots in measurement and analysis. Scott's phonoautograph, patented in 1857 and preceding Edison and Berliner's inventions, was used to record sounds as a linear inscription on blackened paper. A membrane was set behind a bell mouth, which was used to amplify incoming sounds and direct these in such a way that set the membrane vibrating and caused a wire brush to trace the frequency of the vibrations, hundreds of them per second, onto a cylinder, giving material form to the mathematical theory proved around 35 years earlier by Fourier. So Scott's device was never intended as a playback medium, but was instead developed as a laboratory instrument to study acoustic waveforms that were both audible and inaudible to humans. It was not until later that it was discovered that the recorded inscription contained enough information about the sounds to actually be used to play back the recorded sounds. So Kittler similarly points to the analytical function of the phonograph and the gramophone, which retrieve the original function of Scott's invention, where he argues that the analysis of speech, an analysis of the material rather than the symbolic, was afforded by the invention of recorded voice machines, and that this was instrumental to the vast changes in discourse seen around the end of the 19th century. So for Kittler, what was interesting was the way these machines could record stutterers and the rhythms of speech, those real phenomena not captured by the symbolic. So this, of course, comes from Kittler's modulation of Lacan in order to think about the media technical operations and their relation to the real. So Kittler says real phenomena were now able to be stored and played back, but importantly, depending on technical standards, which importantly included the temporality that the medium inscribed on the phenomena. So this is what led Kittler to say, similar to Tuschling, that in the age of computation, only that which is switchable exists at all. The real began to be defined by what apparatuses could pick up over channels, process, store, and play back, including noise. So let's look at an image, an artwork, and think through some of these questions. Is that video playing okay for everyone? Yeah, okay. So this is Jim Campbell's Exploded View Commuters. And in the work, around 1,000 LEDs are suspended from the gallery ceiling, and they flicker to give the impression of moving bodies, commuters in this case, making their way through Grand Central Station. I'll just play it again so we can keep it going. The images have a character of a highly pixelated CCTV surveillance footage, where nothing really remarkable seems to happen. So let's first think about images in general and the new type of image that is presented in this work. Once upon a time, images were created that helped people come to terms with the world. Like the media philosopher Willem Flusser says, a picture of a pony on a cave wall allows you to hunt one with more precision. Soon though, images were overtaken by writing and reading. People wrote text to explain images, which became non-reversible events in time, where cause follows on from effect. The hunt becomes a story, a unique event. And for media theorists like Flusser and also McLuhan, this was the start of what we usually call history. Then with the cinema, images again oriented us to the world, this time moving images, images that were in time. But now in the 21st century, if we're at the end of media, as I'm suggesting, it seems that we allow apparatuses to take on new roles, so much so that we, as the makers, readers, or users, now become part of the technical image-making apparatus itself and take on the role of a functionary within the system. And this is the kind of togetherness that Whitehead talks about. This is the point that I would say amounts to something like the end of media, or at least the end of a certain idea of media as something external that we're able to grasp and use. So in this work, the light bulbs work to form an apparatus whose internal relations give form to images. The shadows in Campbell's work appear to pass by, moving through the station because of the carefully timed switching and dimming of lights. The message of the artwork is not in its content, but in the environment created by media. The artwork, which I'm trying to use to think about digital media in general, is not about transmitting a meaning, but about creating an environment for viewing the world. The images are created by relations set up by the apparatus between light bulb to light bulb and light bulb to audience. As Whitehead would say, these are the relations, the togetherness that constitute the event and that gives some kind of identity to the objects of the world. The image of the world is fragmented by an apparatus and then reassembled by the viewing conditions, standing just far enough away at the right angle to see the shadows resemble people moving through the station. And these are things set up by the apparatus itself. So the argument is, this is an image of the world or an imaging system of a world that is now universal, seen in things like facial recognition, AI imaging, surveillance, that kind of stuff. But it's not one that orients us towards a world like the cave painting once did, but that creates a world that's only possible due to processing routines and that is made sensible by technical apparatuses. So in other words, the world is translated into a system that can only be computed. So that's what Flusser says as well. It fragments the world, but then puts it into new relations, puts the viewer into new relations by constructing an environment like a niche for living. So once we adapted to the environment, then we used technology to adapt the environment to us. Now is something else going on. In these types of works, if we look at them as media philosophers, it's the thing behind the image, the technical processes. They're those things that we need to pay attention to. But of course, that's really difficult because the technical processes of computers aren't really perceived or experienced in any direct way, apart from in media art installations like the Exploded View series. They're always hidden behind images. The media always disappears in order that the message can be delivered. But these elements are those things that create our temporal niche, as Sarah would put it. So now art, media art in particular, show us what it is to live in this world in the time of apparatuses by experimenting with and exposing the way that they work and the differences between the synthetic media pasts and the realities of a more analytical fragmentation. And perhaps this is now art's role, to show us something about the contemporary by working against media. So let's look at some more examples. So first of all, let's focus on the cinematic image and its properties of movement and duration. Because the cinema, we are told, is premised on synthesis and on montage, which seems to characterize the modern cinematic subject position of the last 100 years or so. And this seems to be very different to the digital. But this property of the cinema, as a forward movement towards the future, towards a kind of shared future, has a history of being critiqued. Godard's Sauve-qui-peut is a good example. Sometimes this is called slow motion. That's what it's called in the UK. Sometimes it's called every man for himself. So at moments in these films, Godard slows the action, slows the frame rate, and interrupts that progression of the film, and creates these obstacles to flow. So another example is Bill Viola's well-known video work. So this is The Ascension. It should start playing soon. Maybe it's not gonna. Okay. Another example is Bill Viola's well-known video work, shot at very fast frame rates and then projected at 24 frames per second. Both examples give us a disruption of cinematic time, an attempt to produce new times, to make the apparatus do something different. This is Goddard and Viola by emphasizing the frames of cinema and the illusion of continuity, pushing this very discrete arrangement of time, pushing what Tushling calls syntagmatization beyond its limits. When thinking about obstacles to cinematic flow, these kinds of images that we're seeing, one of the most well-known artists is, of course, Douglas Gordon, who radically extends the duration of films to draw attention to both the individual frames and the interstices between the frames. So let's see if we can. The most famous example of this is his work, 24-Hour Psycho. But he also uses this technique, perhaps to more traumatic ends, to rework the found footage in 10MS1 from 1994. In this work, he slows down footage used to document and study the effects of shell shock on World War I survivors. This work measures trauma and, in a sense, reproduces this trauma in that it produces a sense of waiting by further segmenting experience and blocking the progression of time so that it accumulates. We wait for something to happen, like in Goddard's film and Viola's film. Both are about the apparatus and also about the body. But we also know what will happen. We can predict what will happen in the next frame. It's folded into our experience of waiting in the present and the difficulty associated with waiting because of what we see in the present frame. So we don't have a flow towards a future, but rather waiting, anticipation, anxiety. So that's the cinema. In terms of the television, the idea of synthesis and a shared experience of time was also being challenged. Valley Export produced the experimental broadcast Facing Families seen on television screens, where the viewer and the viewed family on the screen are caught in this kind of recursive reflection. Another example is Dara Binboom's technology transformation, Wonder Woman, where Birnbaum appropriates scenes from TV's Wonder Woman, particularly those scenes of transformation, where there's a transformation from the real into wonder, right? And I think does this in a way that questions the representation of women on TV screens as either secretary or Wonder Woman, right? And what's in between that representation. Another example is Nancy Holt and Richard Serra's Boomerang, again broadcast on television, I think in Texas, where Holt performs with a very slight delay between spoken words and their feedback to her on headphones. We'll just watch this clip. This one's got sound, so I won't speak over it.
Yes, I can hear my echo. And the words are coming back on top of me. The words are spilling out of my head and then returning into my ear. It puts a distance between the word and their apprehension.
Okay. A work that explores similar ideas is Joan Jonas's Vertical Role, where Jonas's performance is based around the technical glitch of the vertical roll of a television screen. So the image of her body is disjointed, organized by the medium. So with all these examples, the domestic medium of the television and its portrayal of a female body and its temporality is being brought into focus. What we see here is quite different from the type of flow and shared experience that has been dominant in TV studies. So here, these artists at the end of the 20th century are exploring and uncovering the fragmentation of temporality produced by media that are usually thought to be synthetic, premised on one thing after the other, on a single linear time or on a homogeneous time. And they're bringing out the discreteness of time and also the idea of what we might call thick moments and of waiting and of tension. So these are comments not about the digital, but about the discreteness of mass media, of so-called mass media. Another figure in this tradition is David Clairboat, and this is Sections of a Happy Moment, which I think we'll start playing soon. So rather than slowing an image, like we saw in the cinematic examples, Clairboat introduces time into still photographs. So in this work, he photographs an event from multiple locations and creates this montage of this event. And the work has this feeling of this event being frozen because of the way that he's dealt with the aesthetics of the photograph digitally, but also a frozen image that continues throughout time. And we almost have too much time to look at this photograph, too much time to analyze what's going on. So the extension of the instant here, the usually fleeting moment into the future, and the way in which this instant seems to be overfull with information, produce the effect or the feeling of the work. The feeling that I would say is one of, again, of repetition, of waiting for the last photo, which never seems to come. So there's an inescapable sense that in these works, that although viewers are offered multiple views of the same still section of movement, there is paradoxically never enough time to grasp the fullness of each instant entirely. There is paradoxically too much time to conceptualize all there is in the work. Okay. Perhaps the piece that shows digital temporality best is Clairboat's video animation King, after Alfred Wertheimer's 1956 portrait of a young man named Elvis Presley. So in 1956, Wertheimer photographed Presley at the age of 21, just before he was to reach the heights of popular stardom and transform into the king. The body of Presley, the body that will eventually become the king, in Clairboat's work is overlaid with textures of the king's body taken from a digital archive of famous photographs. This allows the virtual camera in Clairboat's animation to circle around and come in for close-ups on the now 3D animated version of Priestley's body. The king is now able to be closely and methodically inspected at the moment of the original photograph, which is now overlaid by the media autopsy of this body, giving form to the thick, multi-temporal event. So multiple in that we see multiple episodes brought together in this photograph. Clairboat shows us the ongoing remediation of a temporary instant, not so much in a way that demonstrates Barthes's well-known phrase, "this will be and this has been," but rather demonstrates the way analytical media continue to operate on archives of the past. The work demonstrates that this once was and is now controlled by a program. The image, not a record of what once was, but now a conceptual abstraction, is based on the careful recomposition of a body based on the archive of photographic data and what that body would eventually become. Flusser once claimed that one's wandering gaze over the photographic surface creates temporal relations between the photographed objects. In Clairboat's work, the computer takes over the role of the gaze and in a controlled way creates disjunctive temporal relations, not just between obviously visible elements of the photograph, but between an archive of data in the form of textures of the king's body parts photographed throughout his career. In this image, we do not look at a frozen image, but instead see a state of things translated into a multi-temporal scene, different times collected together in the one image, which creates the subject of the king. So prior to the dominance of digital media, or what we might call analytical media, throughout the 20th century, it was the synthesis of mass entertainment media that conditioned the mediation of the world. And this is the very thing that artworks and films like Goddard's and Gordon's from the 90s, and the earlier work that responded to the conditions of television, the things that they were responding to and interrupting. Ever since cinematic images became widespread, and perhaps even before this moment, it'd been claimed that civilization, at least in the West, had begun to occupy cinematic time. By presenting apparent continuity through its framing of time as stopped moments, the cinematic apparatus participated in a larger project of modernity where the rhythms of the day were regularized and standardized. According to E.P. Thompson's formulation, around the birth of the era commonly referred to as modernity, the workday for much of the population of cities in the West became institutionalized, and workers began to base the rhythms of their work on mechanisms. Pre-industrial society waited for the environment. They waited for the harvest. They waited for the seasons to change. Industrial society moved things in front of itself. Like synthetic media, they transformed the environment. One worker in line finished their task. The output from the factory line were assembled with a repeatable precision. Cause and effect predictably follow on from one another in relatively shallow time loops. Industrial time, historical time, is linear. It progresses towards the new. It comes from the past and demands the future. Nothing is, everything becomes. As Zielinski points out, this is in complete accord with the dogged regularity with which the film carrying the photographs was moved on a fraction 16 or 32 times a second, stopped, illuminated, and then transported again. Movement was toward a future. The medium was synthetic, the focus on what was about to become, what was about to appear. And I'm getting to my conclusion now. A set of cultural techniques were developed for ordering time that were supported by the technical hardware of the cinema, which presupposed a particular capturing of contemporary life by the camera and its transformation and representation as an image, always pushing towards the future, towards the next frame to come. The apparatus acted as a device that Greg Lambert writes, literally causes or makes ready something to begin to appear. The cinema not only participated in the organization of modern time through its technical function, but also in its self-reflexivity, produced images and stories that reflected the temporalities of life under capitalism, modernity, and media machines. So this is an argument that's rehearsed in film theory and film philosophy from Deleuze's Cinema 1 and Cinema 2 books to the equally important work of Douan. But things, as much as they are in time, have changed, as much as time has undergone significant mediations that, put simply, are beyond the cinematic image. Instead of putting things in front of ourselves, we put things in storage. The measurement of moments seems to have taken place of the synthesis of cinema. And this is the kind of thing that Claerbout shows, and also Campbell. The audiovisual apparatus has changed, and so has the time that it causes to begin to appear. So in conclusion, let's return to Whitehead. His entire project is to avoid the bifurcation of nature, to avoid splitting the world into that which is experienced and that which is measured and studied. So it's not enough for us to think about these apparatuses as somehow measuring in a benign way, but this development in technology, a heightening of fragmentation, is a part of experience, just as much as what we might call a subjective experience. Both constitute the event. Both make up societies of actual entities. The two need to be thought together, which is what I've tried to start doing here. And the tensions between the two need to be dealt with and expressed in 21st century philosophy and in any critical thinking about technology today. So what I've tried to do here is to think of the measurement of time, the representability of time, and the experience of time together as mutually constituting the contemporary moment. I've tried to start thinking about the way measurement has always been embedded in media representation and the way that this has produced temporalities, not always on the surface, but now felt quite deeply as we approach what I've suggested we call the end of media. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Tim. It's a great start for our workshop. And I already see some questions coming, in particular from you, Ayan. Maybe you want to share directly your thoughts.
Hi Tim, I really enjoyed that, and it also made me think very much of the movies of David Lynch, of whom I'm a huge fan, because there are quite a few interesting artists playing with this issue of presentation of time and metamorphoses and these things. But I was thinking about another issue related to, you talk about the measurement of time. What about the way in which time is being recorded now? So everything is being hoovered up by data sensors in cars, in clothes, in satellites, everything, computers. And this is going into these big cloud computers, never to be removed. And it's all being processed by algorithms that we don't know. You know, Shoshana Zuboff is concerned about the whole idea that free will is being fundamentally undermined. She has a sort of existential analysis of the way in which this recording of time is changing our experience of time through all this stuff. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that stuff. You know, I think I think the recording of time, the recording of events has definitely changed. You know, and what we, you know, I think one of the kind of arguments around kind of history on film, right, is that, you know, we know what World War I looked like because we have films that show us what World War I looked like, right? So people remember World War I in black and white. You know, that's the kind of so that's the event that was recorded, right? And now, with everything being recorded, I think it changes our understanding of events, understanding of the way time is experienced. Yeah. So I don't have anything smarter than that to say, really. But yeah, it is a very interesting thing to think about.
In that case, could I hog briefly and ask another question related exactly to that experience of war? Because the way in which what gets chosen to be recorded, of course, although everything's recorded on some level, it's heavily censored, and increasingly there are calls for censorship because of Russia, China, Trump, whatever. But so Ai Weiwei put in recently wrote an article where he says I feel ashamed that nowadays all art does is whitewash. My art has once again proven how the art world is corrupt, and that of course the art world has always been corrupt. We often see it as as this liberatory force, but he's specifically referring to his support, being invited to present art at an exhibition where he was then disinvited when his exhibit was in support of Julian Assange. And Julian Assange is actually in Belmarsh for publishing Chelsea Manning's leaks. That's all. Even though, yeah, another version, another image, as it were, another event. You have the event which was presented on BBC and CNN, which was, of course, liberation, success, and so on. And then the reality, which is mass murder, and it is, to me, the way in which, yeah, we're living in very strange times.
I think so. And I mean, I think one thing that obviously that kind of I was thinking about, and that comes from, I guess, thinking about the hoovering up of data, as you put it, is the hoovering up of multiple different types of time, and the possibility of thinking of history not as like as a single thing, but of thinking of often conflicting, often kind of wildly different versions of experience and people's history. I mean, I think that's what the kind of television artists that I was talking about were dealing with this idea of, well, it's not a homogenous flow. Time isn't experienced by everyone watching the television in the same way. The domestic's not the same for everyone, you know? And so I think that maybe that's one kind of opportunity that gives us is to think about heterogeneous times, I suppose. Yeah.
I would have also a very short question, because when I heard you, I kept thinking about Deleuze and his own work about cinema, and the movement from image movement to image time. Are you in the movement from one image to another, which is an important intellectual trajectory for him? Are you directly in the universe of his image times? How do you see your work in relationship with Deleuze's work about cinema?
Although this paper was mostly about images, what I'm really interested in is the technology behind the images. So almost all of these images, I wasn't interested so much in the surface of what was going on the surface, but rather the way that they were put together and the way that they were made. So I think my work is I'm more interested in technology than at the moment than kind of representation, I suppose, and what that and how that technology allows certain modes of representation. So the Joan Jonas's vertical role, you know, how does the technology of the television allow a particular type of representation, or Godard's film, you know, how is the image expressing the technology behind it? That's the kind of thing that I'm interested in at the moment.
Are there other questions or comments? Do not hesitate. I cannot see the pad at the moment, but Ayan?
Yeah, I have another question, and related to exactly what you. What about the role of monuments in Britain right now, in America? There's really interesting political and media debate about the role of monuments and particularly related to issues such as nationalism and Brexit and our sort of imperial past, which we're completely in love with, apparently.
Yeah, I know, and this is one particular type of time, you know, one particular monumental type of history, and I guess what everyone's kind of coming to terms with at the moment is this is just one type of history, and there's there are conflicting experiences of that history, you know. Yeah, so and many different types of memory associated with those statues. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I get the question though, Ian.
I was just asking you what you thought about it. Because this is there seems to be a very strange thing going on, of course, very closely related to a huge drift towards not the right, but fascism.
Yeah.
Related to the presentation of certain images, which we've been indulging in for decades, of course, probably since the Second World War, if not forever.
Yeah.
Related to colonialism, but now it's becoming a more there's a certain presentation of time, certain narrative associated with it, of course, as well, but a strong imagery. And I was just wondering, I mean, it seems pressing in some respects. It's not just plurality. It's a very strong historical force, as it were.
Yeah, it's conflict and the I guess I mean and the division that these images of history create. You know, that's yeah. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I'm not sure I kind of follow.
Sorry, I was just asking what you thought about it. I guess because it's related to the ish, you know, because all this stuff is, of course, related to. There's got to be money in it, otherwise it wouldn't sell. I presume. And so Zuckerberg's cozy relationship with the alt-right as AFC is highlighted and so on. I don't know.
So if there are no other questions or comments, we will stop here. Just maybe a concluding thought. This workshop is a very interdisciplinary event, and many people in this workshop comes from the Org Studies community. And many times we have had the opportunity to welcome people from anthropology, ethnology, media studies, communication studies. Andreas Epp will be with us very soon. And it's fascinating to observe the common points, the common trends, but also the different ways to make sense of what's going on in this digital world. Many people here deal with this issue from an organizational perspective. Some of us also deal with this issue from a societal perspective. But at the end, your presentation was fascinating because there are very close concepts, close philosophical roots or concepts. So it was great to notice this again. So thank you very much, Tim. It was a pleasure welcoming you. We will diffuse the references of your last book. We have started diffusing it via social media, and we will do it again. And an advice to all of you to read your second book, your last book. So thanks a lot for your time. I know the situation is quite strange for us as well. We all know that this event would be different if we all met physically. And there is kind of a Zoom fatigue that we all feel coming at the end of this semester. So it's a big regret for this event. We all dream to be in Barcelona at ESSEC, and of course, everything would be different. Here we are stuck inside the image or between the images, and it's really a different experience for all of us. So thank you again very much, Tim. And let's continue in different ways this great conversation. Thank you. And so for all of you, in a couple of minutes, we will move to the parallel sessions. So do not hesitate to jump on the other Zoom link. And so let's meet there. We have 5 minutes for a break. Let's meet in 5 minutes for the session. But again, thank you very much, Tim.